was kind of pretty progressive. We would say in our time, concerned about the poor, concerned about social conditions, clean water, all sorts of important things. That was, socialism. And so was our principal author, Neith Boyce, because she comes into this story in 1915 at another seaside, which is in Provincetown out of Cape Cod. Neith was living there with her husband, Hutchins Hapgood, and a lot of their other friends from Greenwich Village, because there was a war on in Europe, so people who would usually go to Europe for the summer couldn't, and everybody converged on Provincetown. And Neith and several of her comrades were unhappy with the Washington Square Theater because they were not publishing their plays. So Neith said, let's just do it ourselves here. And she wrote, produced, directed, and took the lead in the first play for the Provincetown Players called Constancy, which was a retelling, they thought, of an affair between John Reed and Mabel Dodge. Oh. But a lot of the friends knew that it was really kind of a parable about Neith and Hutch's marriage. They had a famous or infamous marriage. It was we would call it open marriage, and based on philosophical anarchism. But history has shown it was much more open for Hutch than it was for Neith. And there was always a lot of tension in their relationship. So Hutch and Neith were both really good writers, and they would renegotiate their marriage in letters because they had 4 children and they didn't want the children to know. So they corresponded for 45 years while they were married, and thus documented every little nuance of the relationship. And some people say that is Neith's real literature. And because it really is a contribution to Western society, because they were unusual in that they wrote about sex in their own correspondence, and they thought about it carefully, philosophically. So, altogether, that correspondence is a real treasure trove. They also knew everybody who was anybody in the artistic ferment of the time. So the collection is consulted by people who want to know about Mabel Dodge, or John Reed, or George O'Keeffe, or Alfred Stieglitz. On and on. You could just list this whole series of characters that appear in their letters and wrote to them often. Okay, so that's 1915, the first Provincetown play, which was Neith's, and the Provincetown Players, you probably know, did a lot to change theatrical styles for the 20th century and affected world literature, basically. So, then the next pertinent date is 1930. And this one is kind of mysterious because that's when Wells commissioned me to write the stage version of The Sea Lady, of this thick fat book. And I have not been able to figure out exactly how that was negotiated. The pandemic got in the way, but I need to look at Wells's papers and do a lot more research. At any rate, it came to her, she started working on it, and she worked on it for 5 years. And there was a lot of going back and forth in New York and Provincetown to consult with producers, actors, and by 1935, it was set to go on Broadway. They had the backers, they were casting, and Neith's friend, Bobby Jones, who by then was a famous theater designer, had designed the sets. He also had done the set for Constancy in Provincetown in 1915 in Neith's living room. He just sort of arranged the pillows differently. But anyway, so Bobby Jones was doing that. Everything looked fine, and then suddenly Wells's U.S. agent, literary agent, pulled the rights, and so the play had to be just canceled. Yeah, it was, and again, I all was going on. But at that time, Wells was in Hollywood and writing screenplays, and I think he may have thought that he could turn it into a movie. But again, that didn't happen. So nothing happened. Nothing happened until 220 when we had a global pandemic, which some insurance companies might say was an act of God. At any rate, what happened is that it brought Neith and the Sea Lady up to the surface of consciousness of Alex and other people here at the theater, so that they put on. Did you put on 3 or 4 of your weddings? 4?
I can't be held to account. At least 3.
Yeah. And these plays had been published in the 1920s, so they were sort of circulating always in the undercurrents, often put on by university companies or something like that. So anyway, the global pandemic brought me back to the surface, and luckily, we are here, therefore, in the premiere situation of the 4th living performance of this play. So let's go to the beach. Questions? Or Alex, do you want to say anything?
Oh, I can only say, I'm not here to take advantage of the stage to first welcome our patient YouTube audience. We got a slow start and we're buffering a lot, so stick with us here. Don't try to see this later on. No, I was so intrigued to understand her work better. As we did, I do think it was 3 readings of her shorter works, and understand more of the context of the artist with whom she was working, out of which that work came and which this work came. Because I see a lot of her usual interests in sexual relations and marriage relations, as well as the bigger social picture, repeated and worked over and extended in this play. And I find that really, really delightful and intriguing. And it's a shame that when Carol first arranged for me to get a copy of the play some years ago, I saw it adapted from a story by H.G. Wells, and I thought, well, we're in American theater. It's probably not going to be that, a sort of twee adaptation of a 1900 story. It wouldn't be that interesting. So I said, I took a look at it. It didn't, as Harry says, grip my imagination. It did take the pandemic and understanding her work better, and I think probably having a mature sensibility to really appreciate what the play is. So that's the brief story of how we got to it. And it's interesting how difficult the play has been to get to the stage, because I know other folks have tried it as well. Some somewhat cursed the efforts to do it. There's a wonderful theater in Provincetown who is have talked about doing it, had plans to do it back in 2019, I think.
Yeah, 2019 the first.
One thing happens again and again. It's been a real joy though to see it come to be now, and we managed a COVID infection and still got through rehearsals, got everybody back and healthy on track. Still there are things to learn about the production itself, but that's a lot. It might be more fun to sort of engage any of your questions that you might have.
Technical question.
Yes, sir.
Is it in the public domain? Is it over enough? Because I don't know how that works. So, in other words, does the Wells estate still have any control over?
It belongs, still, the place here belongs to Yale.
I don't know.
Well, then, they have it's interesting because they have the physical rights to the script. And so you can't copy it or anything else, you get permission from them. But in terms of the intellectual content, I have not touched that. I don't know. But it's Neith's play. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. If she was around, it looks like the same time as the, I had family last week. But other great writers who were also in the village at that time.
Yes, yeah. And they show up in the letters. And then Neith wrote an autobiography late in life, which was living in Key West, um, in which she describes everybody, including herself. So that was actually my dissertation work. It was like decoding who everybody was. It was hundreds of people. Yeah, so it was this whole cluster of folks.
That's fun.
Yeah, I was just wondering, well, this is Dave was contacted about any people, is there any we can problem with that, or you just involved with
We've just been going with this.
And the Wells story written in 1901, and then serialized and probably published in 1902 was long out of copyright. So we needed copyright. You know what's interesting? I was so fixated on this. I don't know if you got into much of the differences, the changes she makes in the story.
I didn't, but you're the one who really noticed it.
Well, what I think is fascinating, in many ways, the dialogue is taken verbatim from Wells, or quite a lot of it. But she makes Melville a much more significant central character, and through the man on whose shoulders we see the play. In the story, he is a friend of the narrator of the story, who is sort of twice removed, or three times, however that is, three times removed from the action. And we don't see a lot of scenes, as if we don't quite get we don't see the scenes as they're taking place, so she had to invent that to some degree. And I thought she did a wonderful job of creating real tensions and dramatic arcs within each scene that is lacking somewhat in the story, which is kind of recounting, as I say, removed from it. And created some scenes entirely. But in each one, I think she gets to the heart of people's actual needs and influence on one another. And she also develops the women's characters, I think, in a really, really interesting way. It makes them, to me, far, far more compelling. I'm going to think that Pache, all the rest of it, that Adeline is the heroine of the story because she's the one that deals with this and figures out a way to go forward with dignity and both love but self-respect and still investing in the world we live in. And that's not so much the takeaway, I guess, from the Wells story, I think.
Yeah, the device in the Wells book was that the narrator was recounting these weird snatches of tales that other people had told him. So, you felt like you could never really trust any report fully because it was just coming through, at least two different people. So it didn't feel nearly as immediate as Neith's play does.
Immediate is a good word for it.
Yeah.
But it is also a reflective play that is somewhat recursive, in that the same subjects come up and get developed over the course of the play, which I've grown to appreciate all the more. And yet, at 2.5 hours, it works into it and studies its themes to be more compellingly than the Wells. It's not just a big comparison. The Wells story is great fun, but I find this much more satisfying. And I also want to, as we're talking now, welcome the actors and next to McKinney, of course. Elizabeth Arns, Florence Bartisek, and Ursula Anderman, and our stage manager, our lead stage manager. All of them are welcome to throw in or recipients of questions too, if you all have any about what you just see.
I have a question. So the lovely humor that's in the play, is that was that out in the H.G. Wells story as well?
Yeah, I mean, he was making fun of the British class system, and intellectuals to some extent. But I think Neith sharpened it a lot.
And the other question I have is, you're writing a book, and so all those letters you talked about, are they going to be in the book? And that sounds so fascinating.
Well, I can't squeeze them all in. But that's really the basis, that's the chronology as I follow all the letters, which have been finally pretty much organized. When I started working on her her papers were at Yale, but nothing had been organized. So it was like looking for needles in loose ends, but it succeeded.
Fascinating journey.
It is, and she was such an interesting person. It's sort of a cliche to say she didn't follow the traditional woman's way, but it was much more than that. She was a feminist anarchist, but she was very interested in philosophical questions, and I suspect that may be the quality that Wells saw in her writing, and because the book tries to be more metaphysical than the play, but you know, where you're really looking at glancing into the abyss, kind of, the meaning of human existence. So, yeah, and Neith published, what was it, 4 novels, total of 6 or 7 books, and the novels tended to deal with male-female relations, shall we say, or frictions. But she was really interested in the social norms behind things that would cause friction. But I think that had she not been in what turned out to be a fairly challenging marriage, she would have written novels that were much more metaphysical. But she just was so, you know, having to deal with so much all the time, that became her stock and trade, fortunately. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, in many ways, in touching on suicide, is that subject matter something that's commonplace? Was that sort of like?
I think it's always been part of literature, isn't it?
Hamlet thinks of it.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know, there's a big trend though. There's something about the metaphysics that really struck me as we worked on the play, and that was, and it takes, it comes out of male-female relationships in this case, but I kept thinking of some of the people she was hanging out with 20 years before, talking about their needs and their, what was it, Harry says, it's not my fault if I no longer feel this, or if I'm taken by these feelings, but she takes them and explores the question of whether desire, for example, or beauty are real things that should command us. And it's a metaphysical question or a spiritual question as to whether there are greater forces than just our attractions and our petty or earthly needs. And I found that fascinating that the play, more than successfully than any other play I can immediately think of, certainly, asks the question: are we subject to these greater forces that we experience as disrupting our normal life, our quotidian life, and our socially acceptable life? But we should heed that message. But that makes it right up to the question, actually, of self-annihilation. A compelling drama in that the protagonists are all humans, and there is this sense of something else that we are vying with and maybe in touch with, and we should be alert to. That's obviously the better dream, but it's reified. It's a real thing, not just a whim. And I find that quite fascinating, and it comes in her earlier work. I keep hearing someone like, she's mocking, in a sense, John Reed or the more mercurial members of that group, the Solonists, for their narcissism and their male assertions, but really allowing them to be taken seriously and play it out.
The mermaid,
Yes.
seaweed, does she represent something good or evil? Because I see both. Because I listened to her argument about how we, because of the roles and conformity in society, that we shut ourselves off from better dreams, from feeling all of the wonderful things that Harry wants to feel.
Right. So I think the mermaid is alluring and dangerous, but not necessarily evil. But enticing in a way, intellectually and other ways. But I don't see her as a force of evil, but it's like, you have to take risks, and you might just fall off the edge of the cliff.
But something like out in the Nietzschean sense that she's asking Harry to become a Superman is really out of his title beyond good and evil. You know, this is not a question from her perspective, I think.
Yeah.
But I love Mr. Baker. We don't really know what happens. I mean, is it his annihilation or is he moving on to something better?
Well, death is a mystery.
And who knows whether the sea is a violation? It's not clear either.
Exactly.
Carol, Hutchins Patrick, this is his name, right? Was communist, right?
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't?
No, he hung out with communists, but he was not a communist.
Was he much more politically active than me?
Yes, he was really in the thick of things all the time.
Which one?
Which one
we're talking about?
We're not
Neith
half
Boyce's husband, Hutchins
yeah.
Patrick. Because one day I was just Googling his name for some reason, maybe in conversation with you, and his name appeared on a Chinese website.
Yes, that would
They
make
are
sense.
reading him in China today.
Right.
That's why I asked if he was actually a communist.
Well, it was like, you know, the early socialism.
Yeah.
Whatever label you would put on it, practically. Hutch wrote, with Neith's great assistance, an autobiography that came out in 1939 called A Victorian Modern World. And it was, well, he had been ill, and Neith sat down by the bed and said, okay, Hutch, we're going to write your autobiography. She gathered all these letters that they had saved from their friends. Neith wrote to other friends saying, can you send some of our letters back? She orchestrated all this material, and then she basically interviewed him and took it down on the typewriter. So the book has a very conversational tone that's very intriguing, and it names hundreds and hundreds of people that he knew. He was a journalist, but he was never really much of a working journalist. And one of his daughters once, when she was young, described her father, to a friend, as, my father's a conversationalist. He was a great talker, he had a great gift for friendship, and he wanted to be, had to be, or almost personified whatever was happening, the current thought. He kept up with whatever the current social ideas were and interrogated them, debated them, initiated some of them. And so his autobiography is a really interesting mix of information. And scholars consult that all the time, especially for what life was like between the two world wars. Yes?
I'm wondering, does the sea lady have any connection to the Little Mermaid? Was it meant as like almost a mockery of the simplicity that some of the early fairy tales presented?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's the mermaid story, the sirens, the wood nymphs, all these sea creatures. And anthropologists report that every single culture has a sea lady. There's always some watery female sprite or something or other. So it seems like a real prevalent human trope or something, or what we imagine it. But yeah, Wells was like, sort of inserting all of those different roles of these different kinds of watery people, watery spirits.
Since we're talking about the question, is the mermaid like evil or what is that? I really like the reference early on to Odysseus
Yes.
and the siren. That's a really a short warning, and one doesn't know exactly what the answer is.
Right.
Was the siren a really evil thing, or you can't say that.
Right.
You have to make a judgment.
Like a lot of life decisions, you can't really know for sure what's the best thing to do.
Well,
Yeah,
That was his problem.
right.
Yes. What would you define as soul as his performance? What do you think? What do you think in his performance? What do you think defines as soul?
What defines the soul?
We talked a lot about what the soul meant and
So I have a tiny side thought on that. When I was reading the novel, and I've done some like more mermaid research and looking into that, and a lot of mermaids and siren things and the websites I found were tied together, and it's like they want a soul. But it doesn't mean they want a soul personally. They are taking the sailor's soul. So it like dawned upon me, I was like, oh, maybe the mermaid does want a soul, not hers. She wants Harry's.
Oh.
I don't know. So I enjoyed that. Yeah. So from the place of looking at it through the lens of Adeline, that's evil. But it doesn't mean that she is or anything like that. But I just had that was an interesting thought that I had. It's like, well, maybe she does want a soul, but not like what we're thinking, not like what she's telling us.
So in other words, I'm sorry. So in other words, she doesn't want a soul for herself because she's gathering soul.
That was just something that came to me when I read the H.G. Wells novel. But I'm not saying
I took
that.
that interpretation also.
Yeah.
She was like the devil.
Yeah.
Or the mermaids who lured sailors to their death on the rocks.
Yeah.
Which is mentioned in the play also.
Yeah, in the speech at the top, it just so mirrored what the Circe Ward and Lizzie. That was a little, I don't know, fun thing. But
I think you asked a really good question because the play doesn't answer what a soul is. And the smartest person in the play, Melville, stumbles terribly over how to describe it. I think that is what Neith Boyce is pointing out. If you can't even explain what a soul is, and our whole construct of society, our religious beliefs, our choices of what is good and bad, is ruled by being a good soul. Really? I think it just draws a big question mark, and to your point, doesn't answer anything. I think that's where the joy and maybe some frustration comes in. There aren't clear answers. Yeah. Good question.
May I ask Alex a question? How did the previous online presentation influence this production?
it's hard, except that it excited me about doing it again because we didn't spend a great deal of time rehearsing any of those readings. You know, we would read the play maybe through a couple times and talk about decisions. But I really wanted to explore the scenes more and see more about the relationships. So it made me quite enthusiastic about doing it. And in some ways, the aesthetic of this came from that. You know, the way that we designed it for the video presentation, which was similar, a backdrop like this, but putting the character simply in front of it, talking to the camera, informed the visual feel of it. And it also posed a big old challenge because doing the sea lady, the magic of the mermaid, with video graphics was quite fun and comparatively easy. And so wondering how we could, if we could even make some approach or what we would do instead to the degree that we can't create the same type of magic. All those things were in my thoughts and continue to be in my thoughts as I look at it. I would say, except I think the actors would hoot me from the theater for claiming this is true, that having worked on it a bit a year ago, I have a better sense of the story and how it flows. Although they'll assure you that I have no idea what the story is or how it works or how the scenes work. So I think, but in that too, just living with it for a long time was informing. I can't give you a specific answer though about what we led to. I don't know, Elizabeth in Florence, you were a part of that production. I don't know if you found any significant differences in the approach. Again, we hardly spent any time on it last year. I spent a lot of time on the video.
Well, it just feels like this production is so much deeper, and, you know, we've explored the meanings and the characters so much more. We fleshed it out. That was a reading. It was a beautiful reading, but I think this performance of this play is talking so much more about the play.
I found it much funnier. You know, I was in the office, so I don't know how rebel the laughter was today, but I found that I really appreciated the wit of it a great deal. And some of that, as we talked earlier, comes from the Wells, but a lot of it comes from Neith's colliding characters together, putting people in the right place at the right time.
When I was working my tools to come here, I started thinking about adaptation, because this is a really good adaptation. And it turns out that one of my friends informed me that there's this whole new field now called adaptation studies, where they look, or should we say interrogate, how we think about adaptations. And my friend makes the argument that, you know, every version of a play is its own thing, and you shouldn't necessarily compare it to the original and measure it that way. But it is a work of art. It has its own constraints because you are constrained to following the plot line pretty much, and working with the feel of but it's much more of an art form than we had previously thought. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because I mean, that's what plays are, that's what theater is. It's different every time. Yes.
Sea Lady was written 100 years ago. Do you feel that you've modernized it, or do you think it's eternal?
Do we feel that we modernize it,
Or do you feel that it's been modernized in the process?
well, just for existing 100 years? I think we can't look at it as if we lived 100 years ago. So I think that we bring a modern sensibility to it, and that because it is, as Carol says, it's recreated. It's each time is a new interpretation. I think we lend a sort of modernity to it, and maybe we find different things funny and profound than H.G. Wells would have, or than Neith Boyce would have 30 years after he wrote it. I'm struck, and I can't really go through point by point, but how I saw her sensibility infused into the story, and those scenes that she chose to develop. As I mentioned, I thought Ruben's characters were much more interesting. And I think that we probably do the same thing. But I think the play and the story and the play itself bear that modernization, and are strong enough to be adapted to our time, whether we intend to or not. The core of it is so compelling and successful that it remains its own thing, even though it's living in a modern version.
I want to say something about the costume. The costumes are fabulous. And it's so convincing. The detail work is just right. It was really, that's why I was sitting in the front row, looking at all those stitches and all those hooks. And that was part of people's lives. And everything was not bad. There weren't zippers. Right. Yeah. And so I think this production really reproduces that feel for how people moved in that clothes. So, including the ceiling.
Some of the tension of the play to us in this space, because I was wondering, well, what would it look like in 1935, and how did Wells conceive it? And some of the tension that informed the design choices were between the very ethereal, the not solid, liberated, free from clothing and convention, opportunities that the Sea Lady was offering, and that Harry seems to feel. I mean, Harry is bridling against his clothes and these buttons and all that stuff, and actually representing that. So the way the costume becomes very important to have all that weight and all that cloth there, while the set, although sometimes it bangs more than I wish it would, is more fluid, and ultimately just becomes a door frame and then nothing, So it's been fun to play with that idea of the concrete versus the spiritual, maybe, or that from another realm. We're trying to play with those things back and forth, and that's maybe a contemporary sensibility, but one that also modernists of the early 20th century were also playing with. So in that way, your question is really interesting about what is modern at any given time, and how do you possess and inhabit a period like the Victorian period in our period, and see the contrast and the tensions or the complements that they offer. Well, maybe it is time for us to set our souls free now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And those of you watching from home, you're getting a buffer or stilted or something, but I thank you for joining us as well.